With the growing interest in the theory put forward by Curtis Yarvin called the Cathedral, I thought it might be useful to take some time and actually look at how that theory works out in practice in the real world. We've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about the cathedral in the abstract, but I know that translating the theory into understanding what is practically happening in the world can at times be confusing. So during this video, what I'm going to be doing is taking examples that I think really highlight the way in which the cathedral's power guides the decisions that are made by the leadership of the United States and the larger Western world. If you haven't yet watched my previous videos explaining the concept of the cathedral, you're probably going to want to go ahead and stop this video right now, go back and watch those, and then come back when you're done. Because you're going to need access to those concepts to understand what we're going to talk about going forward. The first thing I want to look at that I think is going to demonstrate for you what the cathedral does in the real world is going to be looking at the difference between what happens when President Trump issues an order and what happens when President Obama issued orders when he was in office. Now, according to the story that we are taught about how government works in the United States, of course, President Trump and President Obama have the same level of formal power, right? They're two men holding the same office. So theoretically, both men, being very important, being presidents of the United States, should see similar effectiveness when they use similar tools of the office to influence public policy. Trump famously issued an executive order recently that would block the teaching of critical race theory for departments directly under his control in the federal government. Now, Barack Obama was also someone who was very famous for doing a lot of governance through executive orders and dear colleague letters. So looking at the effectiveness of both of these men through these tactics, I think will give us a good comparison to understand how the cathedral works in each instance. During Barack Obama's time in office, he obviously issued a number of very important orders and dear colleague letters. But the one I want to focus on right now is going to be the time that Barack Obama issued a dear colleague letter from the DOJ and the Department of Education during his time in office. And the purpose of that dear colleague letter was to inform organizations and institutions across the United States the way in which the administration would be taking a stance on Title IX. The letter told thousands and thousands of institutions across America that the Obama administration would be interpreting Title IX in such a way to assume those that suffer from gender dysphoria and choose to represent as an alternative sex to their normal biological sex would be allowed in the bathroom of their choice. After this dear colleague letter was issued, across the country, almost every school and most major institutions that were not explicitly private immediately jumped in line. They immediately snapped to. They immediately complied with this order and started changing policy and figuring out how they would implement this inside their current organization. Now, this is the power that most people assume the president has, but if we take a look at the Trump administration in a similar instance, we will see a very different response, even though he's using a similar tool. Recently, Donald Trump issued an executive order saying that there would no longer be an implementation of critical race theory, that critical race theory could no longer be taught in any part of the executive branch. Anything that falls under its purview would no longer be able to spend taxpayer dollars and time in order to teach this very divisive critical race theory. Now, to be clear, formally, the power of the president is much more direct over the executive branch than over state institutions across the country. Of course, it is his branch of government. He is the leader of the executive branch. People often don't understand this, but the formal power of an executive order actually only extends to those that are under the purview of the executive branch. Now, many times other organizations will look at executive orders and the way that federal organizations are responding, and they will take that as an indication of the way they should handle the issue going forward. But the formal power of the executive order is direct and only influences the executive branch, but it is very direct and formal power targeted at those institutions. So Barack Obama's DOJ was using a Dear Colleague letter, which is a far less direct expression of power towards these organizations that are supposed to be spread out across the country, who are supposed to be under different jurisdictions. It's much more of a suggestion and explanation in theory. However, they snapped to and did exactly what was asked of them. But now we look at President Trump and his issuing of an executive order to ban critical race theory, and we see a very different response. Trump's executive order should have behind it far more formal power, and yet what we saw was non-compliance or outright rebellion against the executive order by many different organizations inside the federal government. Multiple federal agencies completely ignored the order and went through with plans to adopt critical race theory training inside their organization. So we have two presidents with theoretically the same level of formal power, both using their ability to apply dictums to these different organizations and get them to comply with different standards. One uses a less powerful tool and gets immediate compliance across the country. The other uses a far more powerful tool and sees multiple agencies that are directly under his control ignore his order. What happened? What's going on? Our answer, of course, is going to be the Cathedral. We look and see what the incentives are for all of these different organizations culturally and socially. We look at the theories that they have operated under. We look under the ideology that informs their behavior, and all of a sudden their response makes far more sense. Barack Obama's Dear Colleague letter was far more in line with the progressive agenda. It spoke to the values that these people had been raised in, it spoke to the cultural zeitgeist that they were pushing towards, and even those people who might have opposed the ideas that were put forward in the Dear Colleague letter knew implicitly that even though there was less of a formal requirement for them to comply, they would face extreme cultural and media pressure to do so, and eventually any legal challenge to this order would most likely be lost. The cost would be extreme for not complying. Trump's order, on the other hand, strikes at the heart of Cathedral ideology. It attacks what has become a key component of their cultural control over the country and stops what they count on, which is indoctrination across a governmental and social level in their ideology. Even though there is a much more formal requirement to comply with this order by members of the executive branch, those who opposed it knew immediately that they would receive cover from media allies. They knew that those inside the administration would have a much harder time winning a battle of optics and coverage if they wanted to sit and really enforce that order at the executive level. The personal, cultural, and professional cost of ignoring the executive order is much lower for those that are working towards the Cathedral's goals. Anyone opposing Barack Obama's executive order immediately would have come under fire from the media. It would have been a top story. There would have been a review of their position as the head of a school. They would have been painted as a bigot, and they immediately would have faced significant controversy. They would face pressure inside their personal lives. People would stop talking to them. They would be disinvited from parties. They'd be disinvited from the country club. They would be likely to lose community support, and at the end of the day, they might even lose the legal battle, and all of that would have been for nothing. So what we learn from this example is even though Donald Trump and Barack Obama, in theory, have exactly the same level of formal power, right? In the Constitution, it says they both have the same types of power, the same reach of authority. In the end, that's not actually true. Functionally, the soft power mechanisms that we discuss as part of the Cathedral have an extreme influence on how much power they can wield. The fact that the universities, the educational apparatus, the entertainment industry, the news media, the unelected bureaucracy that sits inside the government, and ultimately even the courts work in favor of Barack Obama allows his Dear Colleague letter to carry actual weight. He wields actual power because his agenda also matches the progressive agenda, also matches the Cathedral agenda. All the incentives line up for people to listen to his dictum and to follow what he says, to follow the order issued by his departments. because all those same organizations are inherently opposed to Donald Trump and what he is introducing in his order. Even though he has technically far more formal power in this area, even though he should wield far more control, in the end, his power is far more curtailed. It is less effective. Over time, the fact that the Obama administration is basically always set up to succeed, is set up to always win its battles, and the fact that Donald Trump has to fight tooth and nail to get just a basic thing done inside his own executive branch, where he should wield almost absolute power, means that over time, the progressive agenda is always going to win out. Now, some people might recognize parts of this as what people call the deep state, but I want to make it clear I don't think the deep state is enough. We need to understand that the majority of power no longer rests inside the government. The majority of power that is wielded inside our country and the wider Western world no longer sits in technical, formal, elected government. Instead, it sits in these soft power organizations. Instead, it sits inside the cathedral. And this explains how we can see so many non-government actors simultaneously move towards the same goal. It helps us remove the need for a conspiracy theory and instead helps us to understand that what we're looking at is basically a religious doctrine that is being supported across the culture by many different institutions, everyone working separately, but at the same time always pushing towards the same goal. The cathedral is not one person issuing orders from on high. Instead, it is millions of tiny little decisions made by tens of thousands of different actors across the country, all pushing the same direction, constantly, relentlessly to the left. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and give it a like. It's a great time to go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Sharing the content is always a big help. I'm very appreciative. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or join Kiwitch in supporting my work on Subscribestar, the links to do so are in the description below the video. Again, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you next time.